everybody, and welcome to the Scott Stedman podcast. Thank you for joining us. It has been a season of busyness this month of March. Not only do my kids have spring break, but I am actually planning on speaking at the Reach Gathering next week. Just on church transitions, kind of going along with my doctorate, but kind of appointed sports ministers. So that should be interesting to see. I've been diligently working on that. And our church is going through a remarketing, rebranding phase. So that's going to be announced next month before Easter. So a lot of it's crunch time, man. How about you, Mike? Are you as busy as I am?
For other reasons, but yes. Um,
Taking care of the baby.
well, it's just been a weird season, busy season. Um, we tried to get together last week and record, and we kind of took the week off. And my grandmother passed away, and
Hmm.
then like she passed away last Tuesday as the date we were. Today's Friday is the date of this recording, but not this week's Tuesday, but the Tuesday before. And she, passed away peacefully. She was 87 years old.
Hmm.
But she had just had her 87th birthday. Anyway, I could have sworn, as a pastor who's done funerals before, that they would have just done the funeral like on Saturday, because last Tuesday was when she passed. So like Tuesday and then Saturday, I thought they would have just had the visitation, funeral, burial all in the same day. But then they didn't end up doing it until this week's Tuesday and Wednesday. So they had visitation Tuesday, Wednesday morning they had a funeral and a burial ceremony at the cemetery. And my goodness, it was just um I've not went into great detail with the family drama that I have within my own life, but it was pretty tense going in. My own family didn't speak to me at the funeral or the visitation. Um, that includes my younger siblings and my father. And
Hmm.
I went there to honor my grandmother's legacy, and that was what I went there to do. And it didn't mean it wasn't tough, but then we working full time, got the baby going. She's just turned 9 months, and like it's just one thing after another. And it's like you get up, you go to work, you get off work, you feed the family, bath time, whatever, right? The routine, and you blink your eyes, and it's 9 o'clock at night, and it's time to go to bed, and it's like, man, it's getting harder and harder to record with Scott. Like it's
Hmm.
I've been interviewing for jobs, I've been applying for jobs. I actually have an interview in a couple of weeks for my doctorate program, uh, so I can get admission to the program. Like it's just yeah, you're right. You described it very well, my friend. Just a season of busyness, and um, we found a new church that we really really like, and the it's doing really well. And I had a meeting with the pastor on Monday to talk about doing some marketing and helping them improve their live streaming and things like
Hmm.
that. So it's really good. It's just I don't know, man. It's almost Easter, which kind of explains the busyness of the season of church. Just
Hmm.
just life in general. I mean, your kids are growing up, and I have a baby, and Jordan, our friend Jordan, just had a second child, and
Yeah.
it just right, like there's just so much going on, and
Yeah.
it's hard to just keep your head above water days. Some days.
Absolutely, yes. And it's also kind of you brought up Easter and just the busyness of Easter, and it seems like all churches are kind of navigating, trying to not only do all their regular things that they want to do, but but then they're like trying to think ahead and start planning stuff like Easter events, Monday, Thursday service, Good Friday service, Palm Sunday service, Easter,
Well, this
you
year
name
Easter
it.
falls later than usual,
Yeah,
right?
April 20th, which I saw I saw a funny video about a guy saying, oh, since Easter falls on 420, here's some good songs that you could sing, like Lord, I lift your name on high, or or Chris Tomlin's "My God." Wait till you get to the pre-chorus or the chorus, and you'll know what I'm talking about. I'm like, oh my gosh, dude, what the heck? But yeah, today it also seems like it's been a busy time for church scandals as well, because there's definitely a lot of them. Probably the biggest one is the church about with Robert Morris, who, if you're unfamiliar with what's going on there, Robert Morris is the founder and and member of Gateway Church. He's been the pastor there for years, but now we're having people who have been coming out saying that when they were children, that he was um, doing lewd and indecent acts with children. So that case is ongoing. Actually, just yesterday, one of the people who kind of reported the abuse, she said she was 12 years old when Morris abused her. She is 55 now. And in her testimony she testified at the Texas Capitol in Austin and basically said that, it wasn't even until years of counseling that I could accept the term abuse. I was 35 at the time when I truly accepted and believed that Morris abused me and it was criminal. So, so there's that. And then, of course, Morris was taken to jail on a $50,000 bond, which, of course, he paid, and he's out of jail now. But right now, the witness testimony, and the case is still um, going on throughout the day, and will still be going out throughout the day today, because this just happened yesterday when she testified. Um,
Here's a serious question. I mean, I know that you're where you're at now, you're like the family life pastor and you've kind of
mhm,
overseen children, youth, things like that. I know that's going to be shifting sooner if it hasn't
yeah.
already. But
Mhm,
Gateway's a massive church. I don't know if it was back in the day when this happened with this person or persons. Um, but like you've been in the senior pastor role, I've been in an associate pastor role. Like even in your own lane of ministry, there's just not time to do a lot because you're so busy in your own lane. How did this man make time to do that? Like, I'm not condoning it. I'm not saying
mhm.
it's okay. It's just like, you know how busy the life of a busy, you know what I'm trying to say? Like, if you're a busy pastor, lead pastor, like there ain't time to go like what are you even doing in the children's wing, messing with children? Like,
Yeah, so a couple things on how it can happen. Ideally, looking at cases, because there's a time where I was really following a lot of church scandal cases just to kind of understand a little bit about how this happens. Because, like when being in the Church of God, especially as a kid and even a youth, like I was made well aware of the our child protection policy and what had to be happen, what needed to be done, what were the certain rules. And even at the church I'm working at now, like I oversee safe sanctuary policy, which means I have to look over it, update, make sure I train my leaders on what safe sanctuary is to make sure that children and teens are protected, right? Because if they're doing because if any time when there's a situation where you can't have two or more people in a room with children or teenagers, then we have to either A, figure out what we need to do to correct that, or we just basically say, well, we can't have a nursery open because we only have one person working the nursery, and that's violating our procedures. And, as much as people want to gripe and complain about, well, we need youth ministry, we need children's ministry, we need that. But if you don't have the volunteers or workers to do it, then you can't have it, because potentially you could create a space where abuse can happen. In regards to Robert Morris, if he's been the lead pastor of that church for years, and it's like, okay, how can he do stuff to children or whatnot? I mean, I haven't seen anything from the testimony as of yet, or like read throughs of transcripts. But my best bet is it probably happened like in case if like there's some like counseling and they need to see a pastor for counsel. That would be probably a way it can happen. Or if there's a child who may be coming to the church that their parents don't attend, So they kind of really gravitate, and maybe they have like they gravitate towards the pastor because they go, well, that's the pastor, he baptized me, whatnot. Then there may be some things that could potentially happen in that aspect. um or I mean, maybe the pastor's there, maybe their children's ministries at like 6 p.m., adult Bible studies not until 7, and maybe he just says, hey, I need some help, does any kids want to help Pastor Robert? And like, oh, I do. And then that happens. So, I mean, yeah. So, I mean, it's something that can happen. But yeah, like if you're especially a busy church at a mega church, like you would think that's the thing. There's always that illusion of, well, they must be really busy because they have a big multi-campus, multi-million dollar church that they're running, which should keep them busy. But in some cases, you have enough staff that you can do things. So it does give you time, or you may actually have a time where I may be doing some Bible study, but really you may be doing something wrong or deceitful with that too. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know, but I mean, there is ways that can happen. Plus, a lot of times in other churches, like with oh Willow Creek with Bill Hybels, and his thing wasn't with children; it was just you know with adult women. But that whole thing is he used his power and his ability to kind of punish people who challenged his authority. So it kind of made him on a higher pedestal where he could do no wrong. And if anyone was bringing something up, he would kind of twist it to make sure that they were sinners or they were bearing false witness against him. And, they kind of do all these things that kind of make him look
Narcissistic
like,
behavior.
yeah, it's narcissistic behavior, but especially within a church, it's almost like, well, hey, I'm a pastor, I'm called by God. So I'm,
I can do no
perfect.
wrong.
I can do no wrong, pretty much. And people listen to that, and then they kind of get lax with any accountability. And then eventually you get to a point where now here's all these women that are coming forward saying, hey, here's this, here's this, here's this, here's all this stuff that's happening. And now the church has, I mean, they're still in operation, but a lot of the things that the church was doing, like they're doing like these global summits, leadership summits, they stopped doing those after the scandal hit. Um, and there's just a lot of other things that happen where it just didn't make sense for them. So yeah, so church scandals are very difficult because it really shows not only kind of the ugly nature, the human nature within churches, but also when we look at how it happens, you start hearing the cases, it usually is an abuse of power. And not only an abuse of power, but even when things were brought up the first time, the leadership team, the pastoral team, board of elders, trustees, whatever your organization would just turn a blind eye to it, or they may investigate it a little bit, and that's it.
Yeah, I think that, I'm not saying this is okay, but like sometimes it's easier for folks to ignore it. You know what I mean? Like instead of like our church could never be involved in that. Our church could never have something like that happen to us. There's nothing going on. Like completely distancing themselves from what's going on in the reality, which doesn't make it right by any means, but that stuff does happen. Not even like to the degree of what we're talking about with the Gateway pastor or, the Willow Creek, but like something as simple as like, oh, we have an usher who's swiping money out of the plate and we're not saying anything about it.
Mm-hmm.
Or we've got um, an alcoholic, abusive dad, beating his child and or beating his wife, and we're not saying anything about it. And they're members of our church. Um, and there's evidence there of the situations, but we're not doing anything because, again, our church could never do that kind of thing. And so I think that it happens more than we realize or want to admit. Um, and I think because a lot of folks, I think a lot of it has to do with like these mega churches have a lot of press because they're large. I
Yeah.
mean, they're on a national scene. They have a huge following, whether it's on social media, YouTube, TikTok, whatever. And, they're seen as a symbol in the community, if you will. But Scott Stedman Church of whatever down the road, maybe running 100, 150 people. And, the news isn't going to cover Scott's church because Scott, it's a smaller church. It's not a Crossroads or an Elevation or a whatever.
I
And,
mean, well, to be fair, I'm sure like the local paper will probably cover Scott's church, but it's not going to make national, or if it
but
makes national news, it's like a little blurb at the end of the.
like beating your spouse and having an affair and, all those things, like it's not going to make national news like the situation at Gateway Church did.
Yeah.
So, um, what are some other scandals that you've heard of, read about, seen, and witnessed with your own eyes? I mean, I said it before,
Well,
churches
I
or
know
names or anything like that, but like,
I can talk a little bit about some past stuff, but I think probably the one that's freshest on my mind is the one that's still ongoing right now here in Columbus. It's a new Albany. It's Faithlife Church. I keep seeing reports of it, both people reporting it on TikTok, which that's not a reliable news source. But then there's been some people who've been members of the church who have spoken out about what's been going on. There's also been coverage in some of the local news stations here in Columbus. But what makes that story very interesting, so again, it is very similar to Robert Morris. There's these women who are coming forward saying that the leadership, the pastors of this church, were abusive and sexually assaulted and abused these women when they were minors. And what's interesting is that Knox County Sheriff was investigating it. They moved it up to Licking County, and Licking County started to investigate it. But then apparently, one of the people who's being, I guess, one of the perpetrators in that case, um, his one of his family members is the sheriff of Licking County. So Licking County is like, we can't touch this because it's a conflict of interest. So then it went up. So then there's a petition and it got notice of Secretary of State of Ohio. Secretary of State of Ohio is looking at this case and they're saying, well, it's a conflict of interest because I had dinner with the pastor of that church and we're friends. So I cannot investigate this case because it's conflict of interest. So there's been a petition for the Secretary of State to continue to look into this. So now everything went back to Knox County again. And it's like, in that example, it's like, okay, why can't we even investigate or prosecute wrongdoing? Because why? Because people in powerful positions are friends or related to other people in powerful positions, especially when it comes to our judiciary system, that they can't investigate the law. I mean, there's no, and so it's really an outcry of where's the justice? And that's the last of it that I know of, but it's a very interesting case going on because how do you, as a person, as a victim, how do you sit there, you bring charges, you get the courage enough to say, hey, this injustice happened to me, and more people are coming forward saying it happened to me too. So you have a group of people saying this bad thing happened to all of us, and your own sheriff, police, even your own government, state government, is saying, sorry, we can't investigate this case, conflict of interest. Like, that's messed up. Like, that's very hard. So I hope and I pray that there's a breakthrough where somebody's able to be able to investigate this case and kind of, and that justice will be served in any way, shape, or form once all the evidence and facts get out there. But yeah, that in itself is just icky to me. That and no wonder that people who are victims of anything, when it involves anybody within churches and religion or even empowered, don't want to come forward because when they do, they're either told, oh, well, you're lying or you're delusional or that never happened, or they don't take your complaint seriously, or and they brush it under the rug, or you try to get it and people want to take it seriously, but you can't because there's a whole bunch of messy legality that prevents people from being able to receive justice.
And folks will also say that the justice system just takes too long, and it's just such a long and drag out process.
And
While-
especially if you don't have the money to pay attorney fees and anything,
right.
because justice is at least a good attorney to really help your case, then I mean that's kind of it. So it's very difficult. As far as any scandals in my experience, there was a time where, like in Micah, I don't know, since you've done worship leading and stuff, but there's always a time like when you're candidating or when you're talking with the church to get hired. One question I always ask is I'm always curious about, why is the position vacant, and
Why did the
what
person
happened to the
leave
last
the
person who was there? Because you want to know what you're stepping into, right? I mean, if it's like, oh, this person retired or this person decided they want to leave, you know, you say that, I accept that. We're good. I'm just more curious. But so sometimes churches are very honest, and especially I feel like the honest churches are really good because they really help you understand, okay, what type of stuff and I'm going to be getting into when I get hired, if I get hired to this position. So I was at a church, it was a medium-sized church. Pastor wasn't there. It was one of those weird cases too, where the pastor was gone. The pastor was family still attended that church. And uh, when I was actually candidating at that church, I got a Facebook friend request from the former pastor, which was weird, which that was a very weird thing to do. Like, okay, I didn't accept it, but I thought that was weird but like, so regardless, I'm talking to the church and I kind of asked them, and they're kind of being like a little standoffish, like in my first interview. So then actually when I was there on a candidate weekend, they kind of revealed to me that this pastor embezzled money from the church.
Hmm.
And it was and it wasn't necessarily and I guess that may be a bit stronger word, because what happened is he was going to, somehow they noticed that on his credit card charges, there was some place where it was like going to like this computer scrapyard thing in the next town over. And they thought, well, that's weird. So they asked about it, but it was like for like $300-400 or something. So like, oh, that's weird. Why is this on the church credit card? So they would ask the pastor, and the pastor goes, oh no, it must be fraud. Someone must have accidentally got my credit card information. So it's fraud. Well, then, the financial team of the church called and they said, hey, we're calling about that. And they're like, oh, no, I know that guy. He comes here all the time. And he goes, I even have a copy of his driver's license. So someone went down there to that store to check, and they're like, oh, are you talking about this guy? Like, yeah, because anytime they have to do business, they have to like photocopy with scrap, they have to have a copy of their ID or something in case if someone stole something, the scrap, they could say, oh, yeah, it was this person. But yeah, but somehow some of these things that this guy was buying and selling through this random guy he was using the church credit card for, and the pastor lied about it, said it was fraud. So then when they finally confronted him and they brought the evidence, it goes, oh yeah, it was me, but I forgot my personal card, so I was using the church card to do, which I could understand maybe oops one time doing it. But when you do it like 10 or 15 times, you're like, yeah, okay, yeah, no. So they let him go because of embezzling money and but more importantly, lying about it. That was probably the bigger thing, is that he was lying about misuse of church funds.
I had a similar situation. A church I was interning at years ago. Um, the worship pastor was married to the children's pastor, and they had taken another assignment elsewhere. And so uh, the lead pastor knew of somebody who had, you know, led worship in a previous role, but I guess in order to compensate him, he was given like a dual role in the church. One, one being leading worship in the main, services, but two, he was kind of like the grounds manager, maintenance manager, facilities manager, whatever you want to call it, campus manager, making sure that everything was taken care of and ordered and XYZ. And so, a couple months go by, this person's in this position, and a Sunday comes along and that person wasn't there. And we're like, why the heck is he, not here? And, because I served on the worship team, I was an intern, like I walked in on a Sunday morning, I had no idea what was going on. Apparently, same deal. He had embezzled money and they let him go. And, you know, by the grace of God, the pastor didn't press charges or anything, but he just terminated it, right? And he was like, you're no longer working for us, whatever. Turns out he had embezzled like 40 grand
Jeez.
and just went haywire with the church credit card. And um I think he ended up paying him back, and there was reconciliation after a bit, but it was wild. Like, you work right next to somebody every single day and you don't even know that they're just taking advantage of the credit card of the church. And
Yeah,
so swipe here, swipe there, it's crazy. So,
it is.
you know, another one I can think of, I think I shared that on this one on like Stories Gone Wild, but like, when I was a kid, my dad was serving on a District Church of God, whatever, wherever we were at the time in Ohio. And this is back in the day when we talked about other churches in the community being like our sister congregation or whatever, meaning that they were a Church of God as well. And, we would do, unity services, or, get together and do, you know, do things together as a church community. And um, there was a pastor of a church who was having an affair with his secretary, and they were in the act in the sanctuary of the church on the church organ bench, and somebody happened to walk in, a parishioner,
Oh my gosh.
and saw it. So I guess my dad had the pleasure being on the whatever committee it was, revoking the guy's credentials, and he had to resign, and he left the church, and this huge, you know, ordeal, as you can imagine. Um, he had basically planted that church, he and his family, and then he ended up having an affair, and you know, pretty much split the
Jeez.
church as a result because
Yeah.
you know he well, I was going to say he couldn't keep it in his pants, but like
Yeah.
it's wild. Like, I don't know
Yeah.
why people make the decisions they do, but like, why would you put yourself in a position to fail like that and
Yeah.
ruin your whole life, ruin relationships with your family and your spouse and your church and your career? And I've talked to so many people over the last couple of years. Fortunately, I've been able to kind of do a bivocational thing, whereas I was able to work in higher ed and I still kept a foot in ministry. But if I were to just completely stop doing higher ed, I could do ministry. Or if I were to completely stop doing ministry, I could do higher ed and not have to
Hmm.
worry. But the conversations I've had, Scott, is like when people, leave the ministry or get fired from ministry or dismissed from ministry or just decide, hey, I'm going to quit, they don't know what to do after that, right?
Yeah.
Like, they have a really hard time finding another career path. And as you can imagine, if you're like 10, 15, 20 years into a ministry assignment, you have an affair, you get fired. How are you going to find another job?
Uh, yeah. It's
Or, I mean, you're obviously gonna be able to find another job, but like it's gonna be difficult to provide
Yeah.
and pay your bills.
Hmm.
Um,
Absolutely. Probably I mean, there's a bunch of little things, but I think probably another one, which, and again, we talked about like big churches and mega churches and scandals, but I want to talk a little bit about just kind of like smaller churches too, because there's some scandals that happen in smaller churches. And, one of the churches that I was overseeing, whether that was in a interim role or as the lead pastor, there's a church who, and to kind of pre tell the story, like through like a lot of my training, one of the things that I learned, especially when in regards to spiritual formation, is that when it comes to churches, if you see a church that may be doing everything right, they're passionate, you have the volunteers to be able to do outreach ministry, there's all this stuff to be able to do things, but you also kind of feel like you kind of stay small and you're not really growing outside. One of or people may not be coming to your events or whatever the case may be. I had a professor one time say, well, check to see if there's any wounded history in the church that has been unresolved, wounded history. I'm like, okay. So, I'm overseeing this church and, passionate people, great facilities, things that, you know, there shouldn't be any way, shape, or form why this church can't, you know, explode and do well. So, so as I'm kind of talking, a couple times I've had meetings with the board and we're talking, I'd always bring up like, oh, is there any wounded history within this church? And they'd say, no, 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 no. Like, I mean, there may be some like weird, like some like stressful transitions, or you had pastors who came in who were caught in doing something wrong, so they were asked to leave, and everything else. So nothing as far as scandal per se, right? It wasn't until probably about, I wouldn't say, it'd probably be like maybe a couple months into it, as I'm talking, and I was doing a sermon on healing and how healing's not just personal, but it can be family healing, and then also talked about institutional healing and church healing and whatnot. And as I was talking that, there was a gentleman who came up to me who used to serve on an elder board and mentioned to me that the previous minister that apparently retired and had a good reputation within the church apparently was having an affair. And I'm like, oh, okay. So, we kind of talked a little bit, and he said, like, yeah, there was a woman who was kind of down on her luck. So the pastor and the pastor's wife kind of took this person in to stay in their house to kind of help this person get on their feet. And it was kind of during that time where he kind of took advantage of this woman, and this woman actually ran to that guy's house and his wife and kind of told him everything that was going on. So I was like, okay. So they investigated it with some other elders. They brought the pastor in, and they basically said, hey, did you do this? The pastor said no. And then the pastor even kind of said, well, and I'm planning on retiring next year. So they never pursued further with the investigation, as the church board of elders are just like, oh, you're retiring? Okay. And that was it. And then the crazy thing is that and this was someone who wasn't on the elder board. So then eventually, as I'm, you know, still kind of doing my work there at that church, I mentioned it to one of the head elders. I said, hey, I heard something and I want to know if you can confirm if it was true. And you're like, okay. And I said, someone told me that the previous pastor had an affair. And she goes, well, who did you hear that from? And when I told her the name, you could just see that her demeanor changed. She goes, yeah, yeah, it did happen. But it was almost like if I would have said a different name or somebody else that may not have been a previous elder or someone who could be deemed as trustworthy, I was almost kind of guaranteed that they probably were going to say, oh, no, that's not true. But since I said somebody who A, served on the elder board in the past when all that went down, and was someone who was trustworthy within the church, it was almost like, okay, well, I can't deny it because. So then that was something that I had to kind of navigate when I asked, well, why never it got pushed? It's like, well, he said he didn't do it and he was retiring. So we're like, well, we'll just let it go then. And I'm just like, wow. Well, I guess there's a reason why you're not growing. I mean, from a spiritual perspective, that may be the reason why, because, and so I asked, like, well, why didn't you pursue it further? It's like, well, he's retiring. Plus, with our church being so small, we didn't want to have another people leave the church because of a scandal. So I think that's kind of another flip of the coin, especially when abuse happens in smaller churches, why you don't see it, because people don't want to report it. Because if you already have a small sized church and maybe someone knows about a scandal, but the rest of the congregation doesn't know, you're not going to reveal that information because there's that fear of everything going down. But there was a book by Scott McKnight and his daughter Laura that called Church Called Tove, where they talked a little bit about their own experiences at Willow Creek and stories about church scandals and how to navigate them. And again, if you're somebody who is in leadership and you're going through a church scandal, or someone who of a friend of a church going through a church scandal, that's a good book to read. The probably first 2 chapters, 2 to 3 chapters, are very difficult to read because you're just hearing all these cases of all this bad stuff that happened at all these different churches. But then the last part is how to do it. But there was one specific church where a scandal happened years ago. And then the new pastor came in, and apparently someone brought it up, and it was something where it was the previous minister who did wrongdoing. But the pastor decided to say, okay, let's investigate this then. Even though I'm not the pastor, it wasn't me, it definitely was years ago. Let's go ahead and let's still investigate this. So he, first thing Sunday, they have service, and then after service says, hey, friends, I want to let you know there was some serious charges that were brought up to past leadership here at the church against the former pastor. Me and the elder board, we're going to investigate it because we want to know what happened so we can, have this closure so that we don't have this thing lingering over this church, this dark cloud lingering over this church. So anytime when they did an interview, anytime when they're investigating, but monthly, this pastor would go up in front of his church after service and would just give them updates. Was very transparent, gave the church updates about where they were at in the investigation, what they were finding. And eventually, at the end, they found out that, yeah, this pastor did act inappropriately with a minor, and basically said to the church, this is what we found out. Here's what happened. Everything that we found out was true. And the pastor said, I'm really sorry that this happened at this church. And again, he didn't do it, but he apologized, saying, I'm really sorry that this happened. I want this place to be a place of healing where people could feel safe. It was a time it wasn't. And we just need to get back to this being a place where people can feel comfortable and open and be protected in this church. And they made a big change. But throughout that whole process, not one person left the church because the pastor did his due diligence and making sure everyone knew what was going on, what was happening, how the investigation was going. And because he was up forth and was saying, hey, what happened was an injustice, it was wrong, I'm really sorry it happened, and it wasn't even under this guy's watch, most people not only respected that, but more people started attending church because they're like, oh, this is a church that if anything bad happens, they're going to take it seriously and address it head on.
As we kind of wrap it up, I have a quick question for you. What is your thought on the process of reconciliation with somebody who's went through a scandal, and not necessarily bringing them back on staff, but welcoming them back after a period of time to the community?
Uh, it
It
I
probably depends
think
on the nature of the offense
it
too.
depends. It depends on the nature of offense. Like I know recently the church I work at now, there was a scandal that happened years ago. An affair happened years ago. Um, and the church handled it. People knew about it. The church handled it the best they could, and that person was done. Everything was done. So it wasn't like this lingering thing that happened, but it did happen. And people knew about it. However, at some point, that pastor has come back to the church occasionally to worship at our church. And, the lead pastor said, it's so glad to see that pastor back here worshiping with us. This person's not trying to get leadership. He's not trying to do anything, because this happened almost 20 years ago, maybe even longer. But it's just a place and I think it might be just a place for him to come back and get closure to. Let me come back to the church where my great weakness and woundedness happen. Let me come, let me worship. And then, I mean, I haven't seen him since. He came like maybe 3 times and then left. And that could just be a place for him. He needed to come back and get closure. But other times I think, yeah, there has to be. I'm not one to say, I'm not one to say that a pastor who is caught up in a scandal can no longer serve in ministry. I'm sure there's certain things that, yeah, you probably can't. And I would say anything that has to do with a minor, I don't think you should serve or be in ministry in every shape or form, even if you're being a worship leader or even the church janitor. I don't think you should serve in a church, period, if you had a violation against minors, and against minors. Um, the one thing I will say about reconciliation is the one thing that I've been seeing that drives me crazy is you have a pastor say they've done something wrong. They go get help, they go get counseling, they go through reconciliation training. But then the person who does the reconciliation training is either someone that's within their network. So, like within their network of pastors. So it's like a buddy, a pastoral buddy. Or maybe it's within their denomination. And then after a while, they say, okay, this person's good. And then they send them back to ministry. I have an issue with that. And I know, well, if I'm at a Southern Baptist, if I'm a Southern Baptist minister, I was caught in an affair, I'm going through reconciliation training. It should be through the Southern Baptist that I'm getting this help, this training, this going through this reconciliation process to come back. The problem is depending on how much clout I have within that denomination, I think my procedure of going through a reconciliation training is going to be different than someone who has little clout within that same denomination. So in some cases, I would rather have someone from my denomination send me to a third party counselor to do reconciliation stuff, someone who can go through it, can give reports to the denomination. Here's the progress. And then they can say, I think that Scott has done the work, has done the healing, is very remorseful. We have a plan of action to kind of help with whatever addictions or whatever problems that I have. But I think that this person is refit to enter into the ministry. Give that recommendation to the credentials board, and then the credential boards can interview me. We can talk about everything, and then we can go from there. And if the credential board says, okay, we're going to reinstate you, great. If the credential board's like, no, sorry, we're not going to, and then that's it. But I think when you do it within your denomination, I think sometimes it can get a little tricky and it can become a little bit more of a favoritism, a exclusive club where I'm going through reconciliation training, but really no change is occurring because I'm friends with everyone and I can just liquor them up or buddy them up or whatnot. And the next thing you know, it's like, okay, yeah, Scott's good. He's remorseful. He feels bad for what happens. We'll send him back to ministry when really there has been no spiritual change within me. And I'm in a place where I could probably fail again. So that's just kind of my 2 cents on that topic. Um, but I definitely think there should be a time. Like, I don't think like I go to reconciliation training and then 6 months later I'm back in the church.
Sure.
I mean, well, let me take that back. If I've admitted to wrongdoing in the elder boards wants me not to remove me from my position, so I'm leaving for 6 months to go get help, and then they decide I can come back and be the pastor of the same church. Maybe, but if I have been physically removed from a church and my credentials hang in the balance, there has to at least be a good year or two, maybe even longer, before I even step foot back in the ministry. Or anybody should step back in the ministry after a scandal. That's just, and I mean, I think a lot of it just depends on, again, if a third party's doing it, what their recommendation is, what their plan of healing is, and what the denomination says.
Yeah, that's a big part of it too. I think, with the denomination conversation, because if you're a non-denominational church, a truly non-denominational affiliated with any other kind of church, it could be just it could be a matter of just hiring a consultant to come in and kind of mediate and see what's going to happen between you and the church, or if there's even a conversation for you to be able to have that reconciliation and to come back again based on the offense.
Yeah.
But like you said, if it's UMC or Church of God, like I don't know how the UMC does it, but like the Church of God, you and I both know that there's district leadership and state leadership and national leadership, and it can get kind of messy. So,
yeah,
I guess it really just depends. But I agree with you. I would long and hard before letting somebody serve based on the offense, based on the gravity of the damage that is done to the church. And you have to think of that too, not just the person who may or may not serve, but the people that are attending the church, the lay people of the church that have witnessed this firsthand. And, it could have ended up in a church split. There could be a lot of resentment. There could be, hurt feelings. You were my friend, right? And you did this. Like that, it's just, there's a lot of things to consider. And, the old expression that time heals all wounds.
Yeah.
I think that this conversation.
Yeah. Absolutely. And friends, let us know, like maybe if you're someone who may be in the midst, or maybe you're in a church that's going through a scandal right now. Again, I mentioned church called Tove, but there's a lot of other resources. And if you're like looking for resources or guidance, feel free to send us an email. Go to our website, thescottstedman.com, shoot an email us, and we can go ahead and send stuff. Maybe you're someone who's been through the midst of church scandal and you've come out of it, and and maybe you want to share kind of how you navigated that as an encouragement to other people. We would like to hear that. And maybe if you're someone who maybe disagrees, like maybe you think pastors should be able to get reinstated into churches earlier than my timeline, we want to hear that too, the good, the bad, the ugly. So friends, thank you so much for listening to the Scott Stedman podcast. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll be back on with another episode. Take care. Thank you for listening to the Scott Stedman podcast. The Scott Stedman podcast is made possible by support from our listeners. We thank listeners like Patty and Scott, whose support goes to this podcast's continual growth and maintenance. If you want to support this podcast, you can do so in a number of ways. First, feel free to give us a 5-star rating if you enjoyed this episode and share it with your friends. If you'd like to financially support the Scott Stedman podcast, you can go to the website ko-fi.com/the Scott Stedman podcast. That website again is ko-fi.com/the Scott Stedman podcast. Thank you so much for listening.